How's it going, everybody? Tactard Ted. It is Wednesday, the 21st of September, and I am watching the hypocrites of the collective Western leadership, all those great globalist shitheads, collectively lose their shit. And they're collectively losing their shit over two topics. Two. Count them. 1, 2. Number one is the referendums. Number two is the mobilization of the Russian military. Now, let's go ahead and deal with the mobilization. What the mobilization is, what the mobilization isn't, and the most laughable spinning of numerous items to make it seem that the mobilization is very, very unpopular in Russia. Now, let's start off by saying what the mobilization is. This mobilization is a very prudent mobilization. It only calls up a small fraction. The Ministry of Defense claims that they have a 25 million person pool that they can pull from if they want for complete and total mobilization. They are going for 300,000 folks to be mobilized. And these folks are former military. They're all trained. They are mostly active reservists who have reserve time, and they're being called up. Basically, all these folks have to do is be equipped, get a quick paperwork check, a quick brief up to make sure that they're still qualified, that they don't have any new physical ailments that preclude them from service, and they are going to go to the front. Now, the general age is between 20 and 30, and these folks will be going. Now, what it is not a general conscription. You are not going out and drafting people without any military background whatsoever and having to train them up and send them. No, this is a very targeted mobilization. They're mobilizing troops that have already had their basic service or have former contract soldiers. And they're pulling them up. They're getting them in uniform, and they're going to send them off to the front. And this mobilization started today, about the same time Putin was speaking, which I'm guessing now is probably 8-10 hours ago. The mobilization notices started going out then. Like I say, it is very small. It is very targeted. It is less than 1% of their military. So, that's what it is, and that's what it isn't. Now, along with this mobilization comes with putting their economy on a wartime footing. So, in other words, factories are going to start working overtime, producing weapons. Now, there's not an ammunition shortage in Russia yet. And they're going to ensure that there's not an ammunition shortage. Now, I've had friends, and just because, look, if you're a friend of mine and I mention your comments, I'm not going to mention your name, and I do respect you, but I'm going to put up your comments, because if you're a guy who I have respect for, bring up something, then somebody else probably is thinking the same. And so let's throw it all out there. Let's get it over with. Let's get it taken care of. A friend of mine who I know, who has a military background, said, hey, why are they doing this? I thought the Russian military had this all in hand. Well, there's two reasons for this. Main reason is very simply, there have been demands in the Russian public and the Russian media for a full-scale, not just a targeted, but a full-scale mobilization since June. And every time that the Ukrainians do a publicity stunt where they waste a lot of people to make negligible gains, such as they've done in Kherson, the drumbeat gets louder. And when they made a large push in Kharkov into an area which the Russians had already depleted to handle other regions, the drumbeat got even louder. So there's an overwhelming urge amongst the Russian public to have a mobilization to get this over with. Now, that really doesn't fit in with Putin's plans. Putin's a chess player. Putin understands the longer this war goes on, especially getting into the winter, that the sanctions are going to continue to yield benefits against the people who impose them. So a lot of these EU countries and states who have decided that they can't do this, and they're not going to, they're not sure about Russian gas, and there are going to be price caps and all this shit. Well, let the sanctions backfire, let these economies crash, and it's on them. It's not on Russia. So Putin's in no hurry to get the war over with. The fatigue that goes on constantly in the West. We don't have the patience for a long war. We don't. We want it over with. This is why we left Afghanistan in the conditions we left Afghanistan. This is why the Taliban now runs Afghanistan. They outlasted us. They knew sooner or later we would get a weak, incompetent leader, and we wouldn't live up to our commitments, just like we didn't live up to the commitments with Vietnam in '75. They just knew all they had to do was outwait us, and they did, and that's why the Taliban runs Afghanistan. This is why we squandered millions of dollars and hundreds of lives of our people for no benefit, because we just don't have the patience to wait things out. So Putin, on the other hand, has time on his side. But to maintain popularity, like all politicians, he yielded a little bit and called for a mobilization. And once again, it is a targeted mobilization. Now, interestingly enough, another point that was brought up by a friend is that first they cited an article for the AP, and just a little problem I have with the AP, with all the so-called media. It was reporting how the mobilization was not popular and how people were fleeing Russia. And of course, they went straight to the source. If you want to do reporting on what's going on in Russia, then there's absolutely no better place than Kiev, Ukraine. Because that was the byline, Kiev, Ukraine. Look, if you're going to report about what's going on in Russia, perhaps you might want to send reporters to Russia. Perhaps you might want to have boots on the ground. Because I will tell you, Kiev, Ukraine, Kiev is where the ghost of Kiev was born. That was where the martyrs of Snake Island, who didn't die on Snake Island, who were taken prisoner, but they were martyred. That's where that myth was started. And tons of other myths, including the Bucha massacre, were started in Kiev. The point is, why should I trust anything that comes out of Kiev? If you want to report to me what's going on in Moscow or Tomsk or Omsk or Krasnoyarsk or Vladivostok, perhaps you might want to send your reporters to that region. Perhaps you might want to gather the news firsthand. You probably don't want to regurgitate what you're being told by the Kiev regime and try to pass it off as a news article. Then, to back up the article talking about how people were fleeing Russia, my friend went to a Indian news site, which I will tell you, Indian news sites tend to be more spot on. And he says, look, they're saying that absolutely flights out of Russia are sold out. Okay. flights out of Russia are sold out. Flights in and out of Russia were sold out in May. They were sold out in June. They were sold out in August. They've been sold out all of September. And I know this. And the reason I know this is because I have been trying to get my children to visit their grandparents. And in March, 75% of the flights going into and out of Russia were canceled due to EU virtue signaling and all this sanctions stuff and all the virtue signaling that they got to stand with the most corrupt country in Europe by canceling flights to Russia. Now, I know math is hard for a lot of you folks to grasp, so let me just lay it out very simply. If I have a large number of flights going in and out of a country, and suddenly 75% of them are not available, the other 25% are going to sell out. They've been selling out. Also, very interestingly, if there is a conscription, then they're probably going to target people who would be, how would you put this, be part of that conscription, are probably not going to be allowed to leave Russia, if this is real. And considering the delay in getting a flight, if you want a flight in or out of Russia, you don't simply pick one up the next week. You don't. I've been looking at this since 2019. 2019 is the last time my children had contact with their grandparents physically. I mean, other than Skype. And COVID in 2020, I watched that. 2021, actually bought tickets. There was a pissing match between Biden and Putin, and flights were temporarily suspended from where I fly in and out of, and that went down. And there were just numerous other things, and I started looking at prices this year, and I was going to have to choose a date 60 days out, and the price was 2.5 times higher than what it had been before. So, countries like Turkey, their industry are making money hand over fist about this. And for those of you who are not aware, this time of year, August onward, is traditionally the time of year that Russians like to vacation, especially in August. But in September and October, yes, they still do. In fact, for those of you who don't follow what's going on in that part of the world, or only get your news from Western media sources, there was recently an issue that the Turks had been accepting cards drawn on the Mir network, which is basically the Russian replacement for SWIFT. And the Turks their banks decided after a lot of pressure that they weren't going to process Mir cards. Now, that caused a little bit of consternation, and basically it's pretty well known that if you're going to go to Turkey now, you carry cash. And guess what? That means they're traveling abroad. That means they are still going on vacations elsewhere, and they're still spending money. And the sanctions have not choked all that off like people thought. So that's video number 1 for today on what the mobilization is, what the mobilization isn't, and the great amount of propaganda that is being stirred about the mobilization. One other word: are there protests? Yeah, I'm sure there are. In fact, I've seen reports that there were protests. About 30 people in Tomsk in Siberia did have a protest, and I hate to tell you, I do remember during Afghanistan that there were protests against mobilization of National Guard units. In fact, I will tell you, Winchester, Virginia, I can remember there was one National Guardsman who refused to heed the call up. and he was jailed and eventually released. But yeah, so are there people who are going to have a fit? Yeah, we had people having a fit about that. We had people had a fit about our all-volunteer force going to Iraq. There were all sorts of protests about call-ups. This is what happens in a free and democratic society. The fact that these folks had a protest obviously means that, guess what? Putin is not as dictatorial as half you folks want to let on. Because it would seem to me, if the Putin regime, as you call it, unlike the Zelensky regime, that is a real regime, if it was really as dictatorial as you folks want to let on, then there wouldn't have been a protest. And if there had been a protest, it would have been squashed quite quickly and quite bloodily. But that wasn't the case. So anyhow, that's number 1 video for today. I will talk to you later. I'll be back in a little bit on a different video and tell you what's happening there.